The snow came without warning. Mayron Ashby had been traveling alone for 6 hours when the right wheel of her hired coach cracked against a hidden stone and shattered clean off the axle. The vehicle lurched violently sideways, throwing her hard against the door, knocking the breath from her lungs. By the time she had gathered herself and climbed out into the storm, her coachman was already shaking his head. "Can't fix it, miss," he said, pulling his coat tighter against the wind. "Not out here. Not in this." The snow fell in thick, relentless curtains. The road ahead disappeared into white nothing. Behind her, the road they had traveled was already gone. She was somewhere between Thorngate and Aldenmore, on a stretch that served nothing but frozen farmland, and she was completely alone. Her betrothed's estate was still 12 miles away. She had told no one she was leaving early. It had been an impulse, born of a desperation she did not entirely understand. The engagement to Lord Fenton Aldry had been arranged when she was 19. She was 26 now, and she had spent 7 years telling herself it was a good match, that affection would follow duty if she waited long enough and wanted little enough. She was no longer willing to wait. The coachman and his boy had gone on foot toward the nearest farmhouse, promising to send help. That had been nearly 40 minutes ago. Mayron stood at the side of the road, cloak pulled tight, snow filling the tops of her boots, and accepted that she had made a catastrophic mistake. The sound of hoofbeats reached her before she saw the rider. A single horse, moving fast despite the weather. A large, dark animal whose rider sat with the kind of effortless authority that came from years in the saddle and a lifelong refusal to be inconvenienced by circumstance. The rider slowed when he spotted her, stopped entirely. Then, with what she could only describe as profound and personal reluctance, dismounted. She recognized him before he spoke. The recognition landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Duke Calder Voss. She had seen him perhaps 4 times in her life, always at a distance, always briefly. She had told herself she had not truly formed an impression. She had formed one anyway. Everyone who moved in the same social orbit as the Aldry family had, because Calder Voss did not inhabit a room the way other men did. He occupied space with a deliberateness that suggested he had considered the matter and concluded that half measures were not worth the effort. He was taller than she remembered. Dark hair plastered to his forehead by the snow, sharp features arranged in an expression she had noted closely from across those crowded rooms. Not hostility, precisely. Something more controlled. The weariness of a man placed in a situation that did not suit him and who had decided, before it had even properly begun, that he would manage it with minimal engagement and no warmth. "Miss Ashby," he said. "Your Grace," she replied, keeping her voice steady with an effort she was grateful he could not see. He looked at the broken carriage, then at her, then at the empty road stretching in both directions. "Where is your coachman?" "Gone for help, 40 minutes ago." "In this storm?" The wheel broke. "I can see that." He looked at her again, longer this time. "You are alone. Observant of you." His jaw tightened. "I mean, there is no chaperone, no maid, no companion." Also correct. "Why are you traveling alone to Aldenmore?" The question scraped against something raw. "That is not your concern, Your Grace." "It becomes my concern when I find you standing frozen at the side of a road, with a shattered carriage and no assistance in sight." He looked up at the sky briefly, calculating. "There is an inn 3 miles back, Hartwell Cross. I passed it not an hour ago. I'll wait for my coachman. Your coachman may not return until morning. Then I'll wait until morning, in the snow. If necessary." She lifted her chin. "I am perfectly capable of managing my own difficulties without your intervention, Your Grace." Something moved in his expression. Something that might, on a warmer man, have been amusement. On Calder Voss, it looked more like impatience wearing a disguise too thin to fool anyone. "I'm writing to Aldenmore," he said. She stared at him. "Why?" "I have business there." His voice gave away nothing. "Business that does not concern you. But since we are traveling in the same direction, and since you are standing in a snowstorm with no transport and no protection, I will take you as far as Hartwell Cross." He said it the way other men might announce a sentence, with absolute resignation and no discernible pleasure. "You don't want to help me," she said. "No." At least he was honest. She would grant him that much. Calder Voss had many qualities she could not tolerate, but dishonesty had never been among his sins. Then why offer? He looked at her for a moment that felt longer than it was, snow accumulating on his shoulders and the brim of his hat and the horse's dark mane. "Because leaving you here would be unconscionable," he said finally. "Even for me. Even for me." As if his own standards were something he had negotiated downward over years and was still not entirely at peace with the result. She wanted to refuse. Every instinct told her to refuse. This was Calder Voss, the man Fenton had warned her about with that quiet, controlled anger she had learned to take seriously. The sworn enemy of the Aldry family, the man who looked at her like she was an unfortunate consequence of a world that had not consulted him before placing her in it. She thought about what Fenton would do with the story of his enemy rescuing his betrothed. She thought about standing in the snow until she could no longer feel her feet. It was not the worst option available to her. 3 miles, she said. 3 miles, he confirmed, and held out his hand. It was warm, even through the leather of her glove. She hated that she noticed. The ride to Hartwell Cross was 3 of the most uncomfortable miles of Mirren's life, and she had lived through her official introduction to Lord Fenton Aldry's mother, so she had a meaningful baseline for discomfort. She sat sideways across the saddle in front of him, which was undignified and impractical, and the only viable option given a single horse and a worsening storm. His arm was around her waist to keep her from sliding, a fact she chose to think about as little as possible, and they didn't speak. The silence between them was not companionable. It was the silence of 2 people who had decided, separately and simultaneously, that words would only make things worse. She had known Calder Voss by reputation, long before she had known him by sight. Fenton spoke of him with a careful, deliberate anger, the kind that had been maintained and polished over years until it fit perfectly into every conversation. The dispute over land and water rights had calcified over time into something uglier and more personal, something that neither family could remember beginning, but neither would contemplate ending. She had accepted Fenton's account of it without question, as a sensible woman preparing to join his family was supposed to do. Sensible. She had been called sensible so many times it had started to feel like an insult. The horse moved at a careful pace, picking its way through the drifts. She was uncomfortably aware of how little space there was between the back of her head and his chin, of the way his arm tightened whenever the horse lurched. She kept her spine very straight and her eyes forward and refused to think about what Fenton would say if he could see her now. She thought about it anyway. She thought about the weight of his arm around her waist, which was purely functional, and she thought about all the things Fenton had told her about this man, and she thought about the fact that none of those things had included him stopping in a snowstorm for a stranded woman he had every reason to leave to her circumstances. Hartwell Cross appeared through the snow like something conjured from desperation. Low stone walls, warm light bleeding through fogged windows, smoke rising thin and steady from 3 chimneys. Myron nearly wept. Calder dismounted first, then helped her down with a brisk efficiency that communicated clearly this was a practical exercise and not an act of consideration. She smoothed her ruined cloak and followed him inside. The warmth hit her first, then the noise, then the smell of a dozen bodies in a low-ceilinged room with a fire working very hard. She was grateful for all three in the way of someone who had been cold and frightened for several hours and had not quite allowed herself to feel it until this moment. The inn was chaos. Every table in the common room was occupied. Stranded travelers in various states of exhaustion and irritation filled the space wall to wall, the air thick with wet wool and wood smoke and overlapping voices. The innkeeper, a heavy-set woman with iron-gray hair and the expression of someone who had run clean out of patience 2 hours ago, looked up from behind the counter. "Need a room?" she asked, already shaking her head. "2 rooms," Calder said. Mrs. Polden, whose name was stitched into her apron with the proprietary confidence of a woman who owned everything in her sight, laughed. Not an unkind laugh, precisely. The laugh of someone stating facts that should have been obvious. 2 rooms. Right. I've got one left. Single bed, small fireplace, window that sticks. 1 shilling for the night, and you're fortunate to have it. 1 room. Myron felt the ground shift in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. She looked at Calder. He was looking at Mrs. Polden with the particular stillness of someone making rapid and deeply unpleasant calculations. "Nothing else," he said. "Anywhere in the village. Storms shut everything from here to Thorngate. There's a farmhouse 2 miles east that might take a traveler in, but you'll not make it there in this weather and back. Road north is flooding. Road south is worse than whatever you came in on." Mrs. Polden folded her arms. 1 room. Take it or don't." Myron pulled Calder a step away, keeping her voice below the noise of the room. "I am not sharing a room with you." "Clearly my preference as well." His voice was equally low, equally tight. "The farmhouse. You heard her. The common room, then." She looked at the common room, every chair taken. A dozen men she did not know, half of them already generous with the ale, watching the new arrivals with the open curiosity of people who had run out of other entertainment. She was a woman traveling without a maid, without a companion, without any visible explanation for her presence that would satisfy even the most charitable interpretation. "That is not a workable option," she said. "Then the options are narrowing considerably." His jaw moved. "I'll sleep in the stable." She stared at him. The stable. "I've managed worse." She believed him completely and without hesitation. "And I would have the room to myself." "Yes. People will still talk. A woman arrives with a man. The man sleeps in the stable. It is not the innocent arrangement it sounds. The gossip from the stable is somewhat less catastrophic than the gossip from the room." His tone was measured. "It is the best available option." Then Mrs. Polden appeared at her elbow again, and the key came down on the counter with a quiet click. "Storm's due to worsen overnight," she said, not unkindly. "Heard from the blacksmith before supper. Road to Aldenmore is already blocked at Kestrel Pass. Drift 6 feet deep and climbing. Won't clear for 2 days. Maybe 3. She walked away. 2 days. Possibly 3. Myron looked at the key on the counter, then at Calder. He was already looking at her, and his expression had done something she had not seen it do before. The careful control was still there, but underneath it, just visible, was something that looked remarkably like the same cold dread she felt settling in her own chest. 3 days. 3 days, stranded in a single-room inn, in a village no one important would ever visit, with the one man in England she had been most specifically and consistently warned to avoid. She picked up the key. There was nothing else to do. The room was small enough that she could cross it in 4 steps. A narrow bed, a washstand with a cracked pitcher, a chair with one leg propped steady with a wedge of wood, and a fireplace that had not been properly cleaned in years. 1 window, glazed over entirely with frost, behind which the storm howled with the single-minded persistence of something that had decided to make this as difficult as possible. Myron stood in the center of it and breathed. Calder had gone back out into the storm to retrieve her trunk from the abandoned carriage. She had not asked him to. She had assumed it was lost to the weather, and when he appeared in the doorway 40 minutes later, snow-covered and expressionless, setting the trunk at the foot of the bed without comment or expectation of gratitude, she found she could not produce a word. "Thank you," she said eventually. He set his own bag beside the door. "I'll speak with the stable hand about sleeping arrangements." "You don't have to sleep in the stable," she said, which was not what she had meant to offer, and which she recognized immediately as a mistake. He looked at her with the patience of someone who has already made a decision and is mildly puzzled to find it under review. "There is a chair," she said. "Take it. We are both adults. We can manage one night in the same room without incident." "2 nights," he said. "Possibly 3. I know. We will manage that as well." She held his eyes steadily. "If you freeze in the stable, questions will be asked. The story becomes worse, not better." He considered her for a long moment. Then he moved to the fireplace without another word, crouching to coax life from the cold wood. She had never seen a man of his standing do something so ordinary without a second thought. Fenton would have called for a servant, rather than touch the grate himself. The fire caught on the 3rd attempt, small and uncertain, but present. He was still crouching there when the voices began in the hallway outside their door. 2 women, close together, the easy murmur of traveling companions, moving slowly past. Did you see them come in together? The tall man and the woman with no maid. "Sharing the last room," Mrs. Polden said. "And no chaperone, not even a companion." A pause, heavy with implication. "Well, in a storm like this, I suppose one does what one must." The footsteps moved on. The voices faded. Myron looked at the frosted window. Calder stood, turned. "They'll talk," he said. "Yes. By morning, every traveler in this inn will have a version of the story, and when the road's clear, the story travels with them." He folded his arms, settled, like someone working through a problem that had no clean solution. "You are betrothed to Fenton Aldry." The name landed in the room, like something dropped from a height. "I am aware," she said quietly. If word reaches him that his betrothed was stranded with a man, and not a stranger, but specifically me, the account he constructs will not be charitable. His voice was even, not unkind, just precise. "You know him well enough to know that." She did know. She knew Fenton very precisely, the way one came to know a house after years of navigating it in the dark. Every locked door, every weak stare, every room that looked welcoming from the hallway and felt wrong once you were inside. He would not rage. Fenton never raged. He would simply collect the information and file it away and produce it someday, at a moment of maximum effect, and by then there would be nothing she could do about it. Her throat tightened. "What do you suggest?" she asked. "No one here knows my name. I travel privately when the journey requires it. I gave a false name at the counter downstairs. As far as Mrs. Polden and everyone in this inn is concerned, I am Mr. Cade Marrow, a wool merchant from the northern counties." She stared at him. "You gave a false name." It is not unusual for men with titles to travel without them when they want privacy. "And what does Mr. Cade Marrow have to do with protecting anyone's reputation?" He held her gaze steadily. "If there is a simple and credible explanation for why we were traveling in the same direction at the same time, an explanation that gives people no cause to construct a more interesting narrative, the story becomes considerably less dangerous. Not strangers caught together by accident. Something ordinary." She saw where he was going. She had seen it coming since the second sentence, and she did not like a single part of it. "No," she said. "Miss Ashby." I heard you, and the answer is no. The alternative is that Fenton Aldry receives word, through any number of people who were in that common room tonight, that his betrothed was stranded overnight with an unrelated man, with nothing that softens the circumstances. His voice remained precise. You know what he will do with that. What exactly are you proposing? She said, keeping her voice careful and level. That for the duration of our time in this inn, you are my cousin, traveling under my protection, which is why we arrived together and why we have taken the only available room. There is nothing scandalous about a man escorting his cousin through dangerous weather. Cousins, not strangers, not an enemy, and his enemy's betrothed stranded together by a storm that had terrible timing and no conscience. Cousins, with a dull and entirely credible explanation for every awkward detail. We share no obvious resemblance that would immediately contradict it, he continued, and no one in this inn knows either of our families well enough to question it. It requires only that we are consistent and that neither of us adds complications. She looked at him for a long, searching moment. Calder Voss, who had every reason to let her reputation suffer for being connected to the Aldry name. Who could, if he chose, allow this situation to unfold and walk away from it? Who was instead standing in a cold room, offering her the one solution that protected them both at the cost of his own considerable pride? She did not know what to make of that. If anyone here recognizes you, she said, then we manage that if and when it occurs. Right now, the most immediate threat is the story spreading from this inn tonight. She looked at the frost-covered window, at the propped chair, at the too small bed that represented days of impossible proximity and no good options. Cousins, she said finally. Cousins, he confirmed. She gave one short nod, and the lie settled over the room like the snow settled over the road outside. Quietly, completely, making everything beneath it harder to see, and surprisingly, terrifyingly easy to stand on. Myron came down to breakfast alone. She had insisted on it. Calder had spent the night in the chair by the fire, which he had done without complaint and without making her feel guilty about it, which she found more unsettling than the alternative would have been. She had expected resentment. She had prepared for it, had rehearsed the expression she would wear when he looked at her with the look men produced when they had done something inconvenient for a woman and intended to make the woman aware of it for the remainder of her natural life. He had simply poured water from the cracked pitcher, asked if she had slept, and accepted her answer of adequately without commentary. It was deeply unsettling. The common room at breakfast was less crowded than it had been at supper. Several travelers had apparently braved the weather before dawn, rather than face another confined day. The fire burned well. The smell of bread and salt, and something faintly herbed rising from the kitchen, was the most welcoming thing Mirren had encountered in the past 24 hours, and she found a seat near the hearth and was halfway through her tea before she felt the unmistakable weight of deliberate attention. She looked up. The man at the table across the room was watching her with the polished attentiveness of someone who had recognized her and was deciding, with visible care, what to do about it. He was perhaps 30 years old, fair-haired, dressed well in the easy manner of men who had grown up never once thinking about money. His face arranged itself into a smile the moment she met his gaze, the practiced kind. Warm, immediately familiar. She knew him. Sefton Grail, the younger son of Viscount Grail, who had been a close associate of her father's for 15 years. She had met Sefton perhaps a dozen times at various gatherings over the years, and had always found him pleasant in the way of things that cost nothing, and promised nothing, and ultimately meant nothing. He had a gift for conversation, and an uncommon talent for being precisely as charming as any given situation required. She had never entirely trusted him. She had never been able to articulate why. He crossed the room before she could decide whether to acknowledge him first. "Miss Ashby." He sat across from her without being invited, leaning forward with the ease of someone who had never once been made to feel unwelcome anywhere. "What extraordinary luck. I thought I recognized you from across the room, and I told myself it simply could not be. What on earth brings you out in this weather?" "The same thing that brought everyone here," she said pleasantly. "The weather itself." "Alone?" His eyes moved to the empty chair beside her with a concern that was either genuine or very convincingly performed. "Where is your maid? Your traveling companion?" "I became separated from my arrangements in the storm." Not entirely false. She had become separated from the arrangements she had planned, which was one way to describe what had happened. "It has been an inconvenient journey." "I should say so." He settled back, studying her with that warm, attentive expression. "Your father must be worried. And Lord Aldry." He let the name rest for a moment, watching her face. "He will be beside himself." "I have sent word. Everything is being managed." "Of course." His smile held. "Though a woman of your position traveling without a chaperone, it does seem rather unusual. Is there anything I can do to assist you? I would be happy to escort you to Aldenmore personally once the road's clear." She was aware, with the instinct of someone who had spent years navigating deliberately managed social situations, that this offer was not remotely as straightforward as it sounded. "You are very kind," she said, "but I am not without company." "Oh?" The sharpness moved behind his eyes so quickly she almost missed it. "You have someone with you?" "My cousin," she said. The first time she had spoken the lie aloud. It felt, disconcertingly, like something she had said many times before. "He offered his protection when my carriage failed." "Your cousin?" Sefton turned the word over with an interest he kept precisely calibrated. "I was not aware you had family traveling in this direction." "A distant connection," she said, "but a reliable one." Calder appeared in the doorway of the common room at that precise moment. He had changed his clothes, which meant he had packed with more foresight than she had given him credit for. He looked, she noted, with something she chose not to examine, considerably less like someone who had spent the night folded into that makeshift chair than should have been possible. His eyes found her immediately across the room, moved to Sefton, and the careful stillness she was beginning to recognize as his version of heightened attention settled over his face. He crossed the room and placed his hand on the back of her chair. The gesture was quiet and unhurried and entirely unmistakable. "Good morning," he said to her. Then, with the measured courtesy of a man who had not yet formed a complete opinion, but was forming one quickly, "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Sefton Grail." The man extended his hand with practiced ease. "An old family friend of Miss Ashby's. And you would be?" "Cade Marrow." Calder shook his hand. Brief, firm. "Her cousin. How fortunate that you were nearby when her carriage broke." Sefton's smile was perfectly placed. "It must have been a great relief for Miss Ashby to have family so close." "I imagine so," Calder said. He pulled out the chair beside her and sat with the unhurried ease of someone who had never questioned his right to any space he occupied. "You are also stranded by the storm, Mr. Grail?" "Since yesterday evening. Dreadful luck." His gaze moved between them with a thoughtfulness kept just beneath the warmth of his expression. "Though good company makes any inconvenience more bearable." He directed the last sentence entirely at Myron. Conversation continued through breakfast. Sefton was attentive and articulate and asked questions that were each, individually, perfectly innocuous, and which together formed a pattern she recognized too late. What road had they traveled? How long Calder had been in the north? Whether Myron's father was aware she had departed early? whether Lord Aldry had been informed of her route. Calder answered each question with relaxed precision, never over-explaining, never hesitating in a way that invited suspicion. He was, she realized, with something adjacent to reluctant admiration, very well at this. When Sefton excused himself to speak with the innkeeper, Calder leaned fractionally toward her. "He doesn't believe us," he said quietly. "No," she agreed. "He is connected to Fenton Aldry. I have seen him at Fenton's table at Aldenmore before. More than once." She stared at him. "You know who he is." "I know his face." His voice was even and quiet. "He and Fenton have an arrangement of some kind, not friendship, something that runs on obligation and advantage." She looked across the room to where Sefton Grayle stood at the counter, smiling pleasantly at Mrs. Polden, and felt the first cold thread of genuine fear move along the back of her neck. He was not here by accident. She was almost entirely certain of it. The afternoon passed slowly and without mercy. Myron had retreated upstairs after breakfast, unwilling to sit in the common room under Sefton Grayle's pleasantly persistent attention. Calder had followed her, which she had not requested, and had not told him not to do. And so they occupied the small room together, in the deep quiet of two people left alone with each other and their own thoughts, for longer than either had expected. He sat in the propped chair by the fire, the one he had stabilized at some point during the night, because he was apparently the kind of person who identified a problem and resolved it without discussion or ceremony. He had a small book balanced on one knee. She had watched him turn a single page in the first hour. She sat on the bed, with her back against the headboard, watching the frosted window and trying not to think about Sefton Grayle or about what a letter in his handwriting might say to a man who had managed her life from a comfortable distance for 7 years. "You said you had business in Aldenmore," she said eventually. Calder looked up from the book he was not reading. "Yes." "What kind of business?" He was quiet for long enough that she prepared herself for the response she had learned to expect from men who found her questions inconvenient. The patient redirection. The gentle explanation that some matters were not suited to a woman's understanding. He said, "Documents." She waited. "My father died 4 years ago," he said, looking back at the unread page. He was not an old man. He was not ill. He was, by every measure, a man in good health and reasonable spirits, until he was no longer those things. Until Fenton Aldry presented forged land records to the county court, claiming that a substantial portion of Voss family holdings had been improperly acquired 2 generations ago. The case was eventually dismissed, but the process required 14 months. My father spent those 14 months defending his family's name against a charge he knew to be entirely fabricated, and he did not survive to hear the verdict. The fire settled. The storm pressed against the window in low, steady pulses. Myron said nothing because everything that came to mind felt inadequate. "The documents I am carrying prove that the records Fenton presented to the court were forged. Prove it with the names of the men he paid to produce them and the payments made in exchange. I have spent 3 years acquiring them. I was bringing them to Aldenmore to confront him directly." "Confront him," she said carefully. "And then? Give him a choice." He looked up, and his eyes were honest in a way that was almost uncomfortable to meet. "He corrects the public record, makes restitution to the Voss estate, and I take no further action. Or he refuses, and I take the matter before a court that will not be as easily managed as the last one." She looked at the window, at her own hands, at the fire. "You were going to do this while I was there, at his estate, as his intended bride. I did not know you would be traveling early. I had no intention of involving you in this. But you recognized me on the road." "Yes. And you brought me here anyway." "I could not leave you in a snowstorm." Something shifted in his expression. "Whatever my intentions regarding Fenton Aldry, They do not extend to leaving women stranded in weather like that. She sat with that for a moment. How long have you known? Suspected first, and then known with certainty. Suspected since my father's death. Known with enough proof to act. 8 months. 8 months, she said softly. And in those 8 months, you watched me remain betrothed to him. Your betrothal was not my concern. You just told me the man I'm engaged to forged documents that drove your father to his death. You don't consider that my concern either? He did not answer. I didn't know, she said. About the court case. About any of it. Fenton told me there had been a dispute with your family over land rights. He said it had been fully resolved. He said your father had accepted the outcome. She stopped. He did not mention that your father had died. Calder's jaw worked. No, I don't imagine he would. She looked at him steadily. I owe you an apology for accepting every version of you that Fenton gave me, for never looking for any other account. She held his gaze. I was not fair to you. I am sorry for that. He was quiet for a long moment. You had no reason to look further, he said at last. You trusted the people who were supposed to be trustworthy. That is not the same as saying I was right. He looked away from her for the first time, down at the book on his knee. You didn't know, he said finally. Most people don't. Fenton is very deliberate about what he allows people to know. Yes, she said quietly. I am starting to understand that. The fire burned lower. Calder leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and stared at the coals with an expression that was, for the first time since she had climbed onto his horse in the snow, completely unguarded. He looked tired in the way of someone who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that they had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. I'm sorry about your father, she said. I should have said that before anything else, and I didn't. I am sorry. He did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice had changed. Quieter, stripped of its usual precision. He would have found this situation genuinely amusing, he said. Me, stranded in an inn in a snowstorm, passing myself off as a wool merchant, arguing with the intended bride of the man I came to expose. A pause. He had a very specific appreciation for irony. Was he funny? Relentlessly. Something moved across his face, warm and gone quickly. It was the most irritating quality he had. She laughed, not the careful, calibrated kind. Something genuine and low, caught off guard. And he turned to look at her, and his expression was something she had never seen on his face before. Open and slightly undone, and covered over again, almost before she had registered it. You should sleep, he said. You were up half the night. So were you. He had no answer to that. She settled back against the headboard, and he turned back to the fire, and the silence between them was different now. Not careful, not charged with the vigilance of two people managing each other at close range. Something quieter and less defended, and considerably more dangerous for both those reasons. She was still watching the fire when her eyes closed. She did not notice, when she woke an hour later, that his greatcoat had been draped over her in place of the thin blanket at the foot of the bed. She noticed it and said nothing, and that silence was its own kind of answer. Supper was unavoidable. Mrs. Polden served in the common room and nowhere else, and while Myron had spent a considerable portion of the late afternoon entertaining the fiction of simply not eating until the roads cleared, her body had made its preferences known by early evening, with a pragmatism she could not argue with. She descended the stairs with Calder beside her, her composure assembled as deliberately as she could manage, and walked into a common room where Sefton Grail had already arranged himself at the long central table, with two conspicuously empty seats beside him. He gestured to them with such natural warmth that declining would have drawn more attention than accepting. They sat, and the performance of two people with nothing to hide resumed, because it had not, as Myron was beginning to understand, ever actually stopped. Sefton was at his most charming, which meant he was entirely pleasant and completely exhausting. He moved the conversation across topics with effortless grace, drawing Myron out on her preferences, her plans, each question placed with the care of someone constructing a picture he intended to use. He asked Calder about the textile trade, which Calder discussed with convincing fluency. He asked Myron about her family's plans for the spring, which she answered carefully. He asked, as though it had only occurred to him incidentally, whether Mirren's father held strong views on her match with Lord Aldry. She felt Calder's hand cover hers on the table. He did not look at Sefton when he did it. He did not look at her either. He simply placed his hand over hers, with the calm certainty of someone making a statement that did not require eye contact to land. Sefton's gaze moved to their joined hands and back to Mirren's face. "You are very well matched," he said pleasantly. Myron smiled and said nothing, and did not pull her hand away. They endured supper. When Sefton had excused himself and the common room had thinned to a handful of travelers drowsing by the fire, Calder guided her out with his hand, at the small of her back, and they climbed the stairs in a silence that had, over the course of one long, cold day, stopped feeling hostile and started feeling like something she wasn't ready to name. The door closed behind them. She turned before he could speak. "How much does he know?" "More than he has shown." Calder moved to the window. "He spoke privately with one of the stable boys this afternoon, while you were sleeping. Asked what the man knew about the couple in the upstairs room, whether we had arrived together or separately, whether there was one horse or two." The cold returned. "He's going to write to Fenton," she said. "He may have already written." His voice was flat and careful. "There was a private letter sent out with the afternoon rider before the road fully closed. I saw the package. I did not know whose name was on it until the stable boy told me this evening." She sat down on the edge of the bed. "He has been watching us since we arrived." "Yes. He wasn't here by accident." "I don't believe so." She looked at him. His profile was sharp against the fire, and there was something in the set of his shoulders she was learning to read, the tension of someone holding himself responsible for a situation that had become larger than he had planned for. "Is this connected to your documents? Did Fenton know you were coming?" The pause before he answered was its own answer. "He may have had warning," Calder said. "Someone who knew I had acquired the records. I was careful. But Fenton's network is wider than I accounted for. He keeps a great many people on the periphery of his affairs, people who pass information when it is useful. And Sefton Grail is one of them. It appears so." She stood. She did not mean to raise her voice, and she did not. But something in the precise, composed delivery of everything he was telling her, everything that had been happening around her while she slept under his coat, made her voice come out with an edge she had not planned. "Were you going to tell me any of this? Before we arrived at Aldenmore, and walked directly into whatever Fenton has waiting there? Were you going to mention that he likely knew you were coming? That the man sitting across from me at supper tonight may have been watching me since before I left my father's house?" Calder turned. "I didn't know how much Sefton had communicated to Fenton until this afternoon." "But you suspected?" "Yes. So when you told me this morning that Sefton was connected to Fenton, you were choosing what to tell me." "I told you what I knew with certainty at that moment." "You were managing the information." She held his gaze. "You were deciding what I needed to know and keeping the rest for yourself, because you are accustomed to working alone, and it did not occur to you that I might be capable of handling the whole picture." Something moved in his eyes. Not defensiveness. Something more uncomfortable than that. "You are right," he said. "I should have told you more. It was a habit, and it was not appropriate to apply it to you. It is the same habit Fenton has." She said it quietly, not as an accusation, and watched the words land. His jaw tightened. That is not a fair comparison, isn't it? He decides what I'm told. He manages what I know. He arranges circumstances and presents me with outcomes he has already decided on. You have been doing the same thing since you helped me onto your horse yesterday. I'm trying to protect you. I know. So is he. She looked at the fire. That is the part that frightens me. The silence stretched between them, taut and complicated. Calder crossed the room and stopped a few feet from her, closer than he usually stood, and she could see the effort it cost him to keep his voice even. What would you have done, he said quietly, if I had told you everything on that road? Everything about my father, the documents, Fenton's network. What would you have done? The honest answer was available to her immediately. She would not have gotten on the horse with him. She would have made the sensible choice. She would have waited in the snow and made her own way to Aldenmore and walked straight back into the meticulously arranged life that Fenton had been building around her for 7 years. That is not a fair question, she said. It is the only honest one. She met his eyes. How long? She asked, and she was no longer talking about the documents. How long has he been doing this? Not just to your family. In my life. I've been trying to count the things that I thought were my choices and finding his fingerprints on all of them. Calder said nothing. The friends who stopped calling the year after our engagement was announced, the invitations that became less frequent, the conversations my father had that I was never quite in the room for, the opinions I held that I cannot now remember forming. She stopped because her voice had begun to do something she would not allow in front of him. She steadied it. I do not know how many of the choices in my life have actually been mine. The fire snapped. The storm outside had quieted to something low and constant, like breathing. Mirren. He said her name the way he had not said it before, not as a category or a courtesy, but as the specific word for a specific person he was looking directly at and choosing to see fully. What do you want? Not what is expected? Not what the engagement requires. What do you want for yourself? She stared at him. The question was so simple and so enormous that she had no answer prepared, because it had not been asked of her in so long that she had almost ceased to believe it was a question that could be asked of a woman in her situation. She opened her mouth. The fire gave a sharp crack, and she startled, and the moment broke. The way moments broke, quickly and completely, and leaving nothing behind but the shape of what had been said. I want to know what was in that letter Sefton sent, she said. Her voice was nearly steady. Calder held her gaze for one more moment, searching, finding something there that she had not intended to leave visible. Then he nodded, once, and turned back to the fire. She stood in the center of the small, cold room and knew with absolute certainty that what she had just said was not what she had meant to say at all, and that he knew it too, and that neither of them was going to say so tonight. The fire had burned low by the time they stopped pretending. Not pretending to be cousins. Not pretending for Sefton Grail or Mrs. Polden or anyone in the common room below. The particular pretending they had been doing for each other since the road. The careful performance of two people managing a situation and nothing more, who were in close proximity by necessity and not by any other force, who would leave this in when the storm cleared and return to their separate lives without looking back. That pretending, it stopped somewhere around midnight, when the storm outside had settled into a low, pressuring silence, and the fire had gone to embers, and neither of them had moved toward sleep. She had been sitting at the foot of the bed, with her knees drawn up and his greatcoat still around her shoulders, because it was warm, and she had not given it back. He had been in the chair, forearms on his knees, looking at nothing in particular, with the focused absence of someone thinking very hard about something he had not yet decided to say. "Tell me something true," she said. He looked at her. "Not about Fenton. Not about the documents, or the law, or any of this." She held his gaze. "Tell me something true about yourself that has nothing to do with any of it." A long silence. Then, quietly, "I cannot sleep without a window. Not properly. I need to hear what is outside." She thought about that. "Because of your father? After he died? Before that. I've always been that way." He paused. "My father used to say I was the only person he had ever known who trusted fresh air more than closed doors." She smiled. "He sounds like someone I would have liked. You would have argued with him relentlessly." Something crossed his face, warm and very briefly present. He would have loved every moment of it. He always said the most interesting conversations were the ones where he was wrong, and the other person knew exactly how to prove it. She looked at the embers. "My mother says I argue too much, that I hold opinions exceeding my station." "Your mother is wrong." She looked at him quickly. "Your opinions are precise, and you defend them well," he said, as though it were an established fact of the same order as any other. "The problem is not that they exceed your situation. The problem is that your situation has been deliberately constructed to contain them." Something loosened in her chest, something she had not fully known she was holding. Calder. His name, the way he had said hers. Not a category or courtesy. The specific word for the specific person she was looking directly at. "What are you going to do when the road's clear?" "Send the documents through a London solicitor," he said. "The matter will proceed from there without requiring my presence at Aldenmore. And Fenton. We'll have a choice to make." He did not look away. "The same one I intended to give him in person." She was quiet for a moment. "And us? What becomes of us when the storm ends?" He looked at her steadily for a long time. In the low light of the dying fire, his face was different from every version of it she had catalogued over 7 years of careful social distance and Fenton's constructed accounts. Not cold, not calculating. Not the convenient villain of a story written by someone who needed one. Just a man sitting across a small, cold room, looking at her as if she were the most complicated thing he had encountered in a very long time, and he was no longer entirely certain he wanted the complication resolved. "I don't know," he said. "That is not what you usually say." "No." A pause. "Usually I know. I plan and manage and determine the most defensible course of action from available information. I have not been able to do that since I stopped on that road and found you standing in the snow." She held very still. "Are you telling me I have disrupted your operational efficiency?" His mouth did something she had never seen it do before. Something helpless and genuine and almost a smile. "Comprehensively." She unfolded from the bed and crossed the room and sat on the floor beside the chair with her back against it, his greatcoat still around her shoulders and the embers between them. She did not explain why. She did not entirely know why, only that the distance between the bed and the chair had become something she could not maintain. He did not move away. They sat in the quiet, the storm breathing, the embers fading, and she was more at ease than she had been in years. In a room this cold, with a man she had been warned for 7 years to distrust. In circumstances that had no comfortable shape or ready explanation. "I owe you an explanation," he said eventually. "You owe me nothing." "I have been unkind to you." His voice was very quiet. "At social gatherings, at your family's house. I looked at you and saw Fenton's intended, and I was not generous about it. You were always more than that. I was not generous because it was easier not to be." She understood that entirely. She understood it in the way of someone who had used their own sharpness as a useful wall. You frightened me, he said, from the first time we were in the same room, which was unreasonable and which I managed badly. She looked up at him. You were frightened of me. Of what you made me feel. He looked at the embers. You were promised to my enemy. Everything I felt when I was near you was something I had no right to, and no intention of acting on. And the simplest way to manage it was to maintain distance and justify the distance with your alleged failings. She sat with that for a long, careful moment. My alleged failings. You have no failings that I have not invented for the purpose of keeping myself at a safe distance. He said it quietly, and with the bluntness of someone who has been honest with himself about something for long enough to say it plainly to someone else. I was afraid of you, and I was unkind about it, and I am sorry. She stared at the embers for a moment, then back at him. In 7 years of knowing his name and 3 years of knowing his face, she had never expected this from him. Not honesty, this unguarded. Not an apology offered without conditions or calculation. Not the rawness of someone who had decided, after a very long time, to stop managing how they appeared and simply say the plain truth of it. She turned to look up at him. He looked down at her at the same moment. The distance between them was very small. The fire was nearly gone. The storm outside pressed against the window with a gentleness it had not had before, as though it too had exhausted its reasons for resistance. She did not decide to reach up and take his hand from the arm of the chair. She simply did it. He looked at their joined hands, then at her face. Then he closed his eyes briefly. The expression of a man stepping off a ledge he has been standing at the edge of for a long time and has finally stopped debating. This is not a good idea, he said. I know. It will complicate everything. Everything is already complicated. Myron. Her name, the way he said it now, worn down to something real. If I kiss you, I will not be able to pretend, afterward, that I didn't mean it. She looked at him steadily, her hand in his, the last warmth of the embers between them. Then don't pretend, she said. He kissed her, not tentatively, not the careful managed gesture of someone preserving his options. The kiss of a person who had stopped calculating and was simply, finally, choosing. And it carried the weight of a cold road and a broken wheel and 2 days of everything said and not said, in a small room where the truth had nowhere else to go. She kissed him back with everything she had held steadily in place since the moment she had taken his hand in the snow, and noticed, against every sensible intention, that it was warm. Neither of them pretended afterward. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The fire went cold. The storm settled to nothing. They remained exactly where they were, because neither of them could think of a single reason to be anywhere else. She fell asleep against his shoulder, with his arm around her, and outside, the storm that had started everything finally, quietly and without ceremony, began to ease. The light came in thin and pale through the frost-edged window. Myron woke to the particular stillness of a room that had been quiet long enough to feel like something other than absence. She was on the bed, not on the floor beside the chair where she had fallen asleep, which meant he had moved her at some point in the night, with enough care that she had not woken. She was still dressed. The greatcoat was over her. The fire had been built back up, which meant he had been awake before her, perhaps long before her. He was standing by the window, dressed. Jacket, coat, cravat tied with his usual precision. His bag was sitting beside the door. She understood what she was looking at before she had fully woken to it. The storm, she said, broke before dawn. His voice was even, careful, everything in it placed correctly. The road to Aldenmore is passable. The way south opens by mid-morning. She sat up. Calder. The carriage wheel has been repaired. The stable hand worked on it through the night. It will hold the journey. He had not turned from the window. We should leave within the hour. I will settle the account downstairs. Calder. She said his name again, the way she had said it last night, with the weight it had been given last night. And he finally turned. She had dreaded what she would find in his face, and it was exactly what she had dreaded. Composed. Correct. Every wall rebuilt in the night while she slept under his coat and had no idea it was happening. He had been awake for hours. She understood now. He had moved her carefully from the floor to the bed and rebuilt the fire so the room would be warm when she woke, and rebuilt himself while he was at it, brick by careful brick, before she had the chance to say a word. What occurred last night, he said, and his voice was the voice of a man presenting an argument he has prepared carefully, was a consequence of circumstance, extended proximity, disruption to ordinary routine, the particular unreality of being removed from our ordinary lives. It should not have happened. It will not be repeated, and it doesn't need to define anything that follows. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. You are afraid, she said. I am being sensible. You are using sensible as a name for afraid. She kept her voice level. She had decided, before he had finished his second sentence, that she was not going to let it break in front of him. Last night you said you would not pretend you did not mean it. Those were your words. Last night I was not thinking with appropriate clarity. You were thinking more clearly than you have allowed yourself to in years. Myron. Her name. Harder now. More managed. I came to this county to expose Fenton Aldry. I am your betrothed, sworn enemy. My name, my family, my entire purpose for being on that road. None of these are things that can be explained to your father or your brother, without consequences that extend well beyond anything we can manage from a single room in a country inn. I know that. Then you understand why this cannot. He stopped, began again. Last night was a mistake. The word landed exactly as she had known it would, which did not alter how it landed. She stood. She picked up his greatcoat from where it had covered her, and she held it out to him, and when he came forward to take it, she made certain their hands did not touch. Is that what you truly believe? She asked, her voice entirely steady. Or is it what you have decided to believe because it is the easier thing to carry going forward? He said nothing. You told me yesterday that Fenton constructs circumstances and presents people with outcomes he has already decided on, she said. You are doing exactly that right now. You have decided the outcome of last night. You are presenting it to me as the only reasonable conclusion, and you are calling it sensible so that neither of us has to sit with what it actually is. He put the coat on, picked up his bag from beside the door. I will settle the account. Be ready to leave within the hour. Calder. Please. One word, with nothing decorative around it, just the effort it took to say it. Please do not make this harder than it already is. The door opened and closed. She stood in the room that still carried the smell of wood smoke and 2 days of stripped-down honesty. She looked at the embers and the brightening window and the impression in the seat of the chair where he had spent 2 nights folded into something smaller than he was, and she allowed herself exactly 60 seconds to feel the full, unedited weight of it. She had told herself she would not cry. She did not cry. She stood in the cold room and breathed and let the 60 seconds pass, and when they were done, she put herself back together with the same deliberate efficiency he used for everything, because it was the only tool she had available to her, and because breaking in an inn in a snowstorm with no one to witness it and nothing to gain from it was not something she was willing to do. Then she folded the blanket at the foot of the bed. She repined her hair with careful, deliberate movements. She packed her trunk, placing each item with precision, grateful for the task and its requirement of attention. She put on her cloak and smoothed it flat and picked up her gloves. She opened the door. The hallway was empty. From somewhere below came the sounds of the common room starting its morning, crockery and voices, and the smell of bread. Her boots were quiet on the narrow stairs, one hand on the wall, the other holding her gloves. At the bottom of the stairs, standing in the narrow hallway with his hat in both hands, and all the warmth entirely gone from his expression, was Sefton Grail. She had forgotten entirely about Sefton Grail. He was standing at the foot of the stairs in the flat morning light, with none of the careful warmth he had worn through 2 days of meals and careful conversation. The performance was over. She could see it clearly now, and she suspected he could see her seeing it. "Miss Ashby," he said, "a word before you leave. I have a carriage to make ready. This will not take long." He did not move. "I know who your cousin is." She held very still and said nothing. "I recognized him the first morning," Sefton said. "I was not certain at breakfast. By supper I was." He held her gaze with the particular steadiness of someone who believes he holds every available card. "Cade Marrow is Calder Voss, the Duke of Voss, your betrothed sworn enemy, and you have been sharing a room with him for 3 days." She kept her face neutral. "You are mistaken. I am not." His voice was almost gentle, as though this were a kindness he was doing her. "I served briefly under Lord Voss's father 20 years ago. I know the son, the height, the manner, the eyes. I have been certain since the first evening." A pause. "Lord Aldry will want to know." She said nothing. "He is likely writing to you already," Sefton continued, "based on the letter I sent 2 days ago. That letter contained certain observations about the man traveling with you and certain questions about the nature of your arrangement." He turned his hat slowly in his hands. "But I find myself this morning feeling that there may be another way to manage this, one that serves everyone's interests." "What way?" she said, keeping her voice even. "You return to Aldenmore. You tell Lord Aldry that you were stranded by the storm, and that the man who assisted you was a stranger whose name you never properly learned. You say nothing more than that." He offered her a small, reasonable smile. "And in my next letter to Lord Aldry, I confirm the same account." She had seen the architecture of it clearly enough since breakfast. She would carry this secret back to Fenton's house, with Sefton holding the other end of it, and he would pull the thread whenever it was useful, in service of whatever he needed from Fenton or from her family, for as long as it was useful. Not a rescue. It had never been a rescue. "No," she said. The smile held. "Miss Ashby, you should think very carefully before." "I have thought." She met his eyes. "I decline." "Then I will have no choice but to send Lord Aldry the complete account." The warmth left his voice in degrees. 3 days in one room, his enemy. I think you understand what a story like that does once it begins to move. Calder appeared in the doorway of the common room. He had heard enough. She could see it in the quality of stillness that had come over him, the focused quiet of someone who had arrived at the last part of a conversation and understood its full shape from those few words. His eyes moved from Sefton to her, and whatever he read in her face resolved something in his. He crossed the hallway and stood beside her, and he did not pretend to be anyone else. "Mr. Grail," he said, and his voice was very quiet in the way that quiet voices were when they carried something heavier than volume. "My name is Calder Voss. I believe you have already worked that out." Sefton's carefully held composure shifted. "Your Grace," he said, adjusting. "You sent a letter to Fenton Aldry 2 days ago with specific observations about Miss Ashby and her traveling companion." Calder held his gaze with the unhurried precision of someone who has already determined the outcome, and sees no reason to perform urgency about arriving there. You are this morning offering to revise or expand that account, depending on what Miss Ashby agrees to provide you in return." The common room had gone very still. Several travelers had looked up from their breakfasts with the alertness of people who had recognized that the conversation in the hallway was no longer a private one. Mrs. Polden stood behind the counter with a ledger open and her eyes moving carefully between the three of them. "I was concerned for Miss Ashby's welfare," Sefton said. "I know exactly what you were concerned for." Calder did not look away. "I know the nature of the arrangement you maintain with Lord Aldry. I know the terms under which you have passed information to him over the past 3 years, and the accounts through which those payments have been received. Your name appears in a very detailed account of Lord Aldry's private business conduct that will reach a London solicitor before this afternoon." The color left Sefton Grayle's face with a thoroughness that was striking to observe. "You will write a correction to whatever you sent 2 days ago," Calder said. "You will send it today, before the roads fully open. You will state that Miss Ashby was traveling under her cousin's protection and that nothing of concern occurred. And you will not communicate with Lord Aldray again, in any capacity, on any subject." "And if I don't?" Sefton said, though the question had very little behind it now. "Then everything I know about your arrangement with him goes directly to your father." A silence, brief and complete. I believe Viscount Grayle is unaware of the precise nature of his son's activities. Sefton looked at Myron for a long moment. She looked back at him and said nothing. He put his hat on with the careful movement of a man preserving what remained of his dignity. "Good day, Miss Ashby," he said, with the last working remnant of his manners. "I hope the remainder of your journey is without incident." He walked out the front door of Hartwell Cross into the cold, bright morning, and the door swung shut behind him, and Mrs. Polden turned back to her ledger, as though she had not witnessed a single word of it. She turned to Calder. He was looking at the closed door. The controlled certainty was beginning to ease from his shoulders now that it was no longer required, and underneath it, he looked tired in the way she had come to recognize as his particular kind of tired. "You could have told me you knew all of that," she said. "Yes," he said. "I could have." She looked at him for one long moment. Then she turned and walked back up the stairs, and she heard him follow her, and she did not tell him not to. The room felt different in morning light, smaller in some ways, and more honest in all of them, without the cover of firelight and a storm that had made everything feel briefly and seductively outside the ordinary rules. She stood by the window. The frost was clearing at the edges of the glass. Through the thinner patches, she could see the white countryside outside, quiet in the weak winter sun, the road south already showing the dark tracks of earlier wheels. She did not turn around when he came in and closed the door. "I am not going to Aldenmore," she said. "I know. I am going to send word to my father from here. Then I am going home." She looked at the road. "And I am going to ask him to dissolve the engagement formally, in my own voice, with my own reasons, not because of circumstances or scandal or anything that was done to me, because I am choosing to, because it is what I should have done months ago, and I was afraid of what it would cost my family. Myron, don't." She turned then. "Don't say something careful right now. You have just stood in the hallway of a country inn and announced your real name to a man who was threatening me, and told him you would expose him before you let him expose me. I need you to do me the courtesy of not immediately retreating back into being managed and correct." He was standing just inside the door. The morning light was honest, and she had come to prefer his face honest to any other version of it. "I don't know how to do this," he said. She waited. "Whatever this is, I know how to plan, how to build a case, how to manage the available information and determine the most defensible course from it. I do not know how to stand in a room with you and say what I feel without immediately constructing reasons why it is inadvisable. Say it first, she said. Find the reasons after. His jaw worked. I am in love with you. The words landed in the small room with the simple weight of something that had been true long enough to be exhausted by being untrue. She looked at him steadily. How long? He crossed his arms, which she had learned was the gesture of someone holding himself in place against something he does not quite trust himself not to move toward. 2 years ago. Christmas, at your father's house. Your brother had invited me, and I had come because I had not yet assembled sufficient reason to decline. You were arguing with the vicar about land enclosure. He held her gaze. You were wrong about 3 of your 4 points, and entirely right about the one that mattered, and you knew exactly which one it was, and you aimed the entire argument at that single point, and let him win the other 3 because you did not care about the other 3. She stared at him. You fell in love with me while I was arguing about land policy with a vicar. I watched you be precisely yourself in a room full of people who would have been more comfortable with approximately yourself, he said. And yes, that is when it became a problem. 2 years, she said. There is no sensible future here. His voice was even. His eyes were not. I came to this county to expose your betrothed. My family and his have been enemies for 2 generations. I have spent 3 years building a case against a man who was supposed to become your husband. The damage to both our reputations from this inn alone is something we have not yet fully measured. I know all of that. And I am a man who has been consumed by anger and a mission built almost entirely on grief, and I am not certain I know what I am without those things. I am not certain I am sufficient for what you deserve. She looked at him for a long moment. I think you are a great many things that you have been too occupied to notice, she said. I think you are patient when it matters, and honest when it costs you something, and I think you rebuilt a propped chair without being asked, and covered me with your coat while I slept, and told me the truth about your father, even when saying it aloud was difficult. I think you have been sufficient for a very long time. I think you have simply been determined not to find out. He was very still. Send the documents today, she said, through your solicitor, from here, before we leave, so that the case against Fenton proceeds on its own terms and its own merit, independent of anything between us. Your father's name, cleared properly. She held his gaze. And then we face whatever comes next. He stared at her. You have them with you, she said. You said so. Send them this morning. Let that be done cleanly, and then we deal with everything else. The silence that followed was different from every silence they had shared in 3 days. Not careful, not charged with the vigilance of 2 people managing each other at close range. Just the quiet of 2 people in morning light, having run entirely out of reasons to be anywhere except exactly where they were. I have not asked you, he said at last, what you want. Not the way it deserves to be asked. She waited. Mirren Ashby. Both words, her full name, said with the focused attention he gave to everything he had decided to take seriously. What do you want? She did not need a moment to find it. That surprised her, given how long she had not been asked. You, she said. Not because I am stranded, or frightened, or grateful for being helped off a broken road. Because you are honest in ways that are inconvenient and correct in ways that are irritating. And you looked at a woman arguing about land enclosure and found that interesting rather than exhausting. She held his gaze. Because I have not felt entirely like myself in a very long time. And I feel like myself when I am arguing with you. He crossed the room and kissed her in the full pale light of the morning, and there was nothing tentative in it, and nothing managed, and she kissed him back with everything the night before had started, and the morning had tried to interrupt, and the hallway had finished resolving. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers, breathing. "The documents go today," he said. "Today," she agreed. "And then your father." "Yes." She pulled back just enough to look at him. "He is going to have a considerable number of questions. I have answers for all of them. He may not enjoy the answers." "No," Calder said, "but they will be honest ones." They left Hartwell Cross at mid-morning. The documents went first. Sealed in Calder's hand, dispatched by the inn's fastest rider to the London solicitor before the carriage had moved a single turn of its repaired wheel. It was done without ceremony, with the quiet economy of someone who had waited 3 years for the right moment and had arrived at it by entirely unplanned means in an inn in a snowstorm, and who had made peace with the fact that justice rarely arrived on the road you had prepared for it. Myron watched the rider disappear down the brightening road and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a long time. The journey south was slow and careful. Calder rode alongside the carriage rather than inside, which gave her space to sit with her own thinking. And the thinking was less frightening than it had been at the start of the week. Things had clearer shapes, even when they were not simple shapes. She was going to dissolve the engagement herself, not have it dissolved by circumstance or scandal or anyone else's decision. In her own voice, with her own reasoning. That was the first thing and the most important thing. She was going to tell her father the complete truth because she was done managing information for other people's comfort. And whatever came after those two things, she and Calder would meet together, which 3 days ago had not been a sentence she could have constructed, and which now felt like the most available thing in the world. They reached her family's estate in the late afternoon. Her father was in the drive. He was not alone. Standing beside him, in traveling clothes, and the expression of someone who had received several letters and written out in response to all of them at once, was Lord Fenton Aldray. Myron saw him through the carriage window and waited for the old familiar anxiety to arrive, the careful recalibration of herself that had always preceded any encounter with him, the assembling of the appropriate version. The correct one, the one he had designed. It did not come. There was only clarity, sharp-edged and clean. She descended from the carriage before anyone could hand her down, and she walked toward her father, with her back straight and her hands still. "Papa," she said, "I'm sorry for the worry. I am well." Her father took her by the shoulders and looked at her face with the focused attention of someone checking something he could not name, but would know when he found. Whatever he found, it settled something in him too. "Are you truly all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and meant it in every way he was asking. Fenton stepped forward. "Miss Ashby." His voice was measured and warm and placed exactly as it always was, and she heard it now with complete clarity, the precision of its construction, every word chosen for the impression it made rather than the truth it carried. "I have been very concerned. Your journey was highly irregular." "It was," she said. "We should speak privately." "Indeed." His gaze moved past her and found Calder, who had dismounted and come to stand at her side. Something moved in Fenton's expression that was controlled immediately, but not immediately enough. Recognition, and something beneath it that was sharper and less composed. "I was not aware you had traveled with company." Calder did not offer his assumed name. "Lord Aldray," he said, and his voice carried the particular quality of something long anticipated being finally allowed to land. "My name is Calder Voss. I believe you know it." The drive went entirely silent. Her father looked between them. Fenton's face had done something very rapid and very careful. "Lord Voss," he said, This is unexpected. For me as well. Though I suspect rather less so for you. Calder's voice was quiet and aimed with precision. You were aware I was coming to Aldenmore. The documents you forged. The case against my father. The men you paid. All of that is now in the hands of a London solicitor, with instructions to proceed regardless of any other outcome. He paused once. Including this one. Fenton looked at Myron then. Not at Calder. At her, with the expression she recognized from years of knowing him, the one he produced when he was calculating how to manage something and had not yet found the angle. And you, he said. Were you aware of all this? I became aware of it at the inn, she said, and I believe him completely. Something resolved in Fenton's expression into a colder, quieter register. This is a serious accusation. It is a documented one, Calder said. The drive remained very still. Her father broke it, with the measured directness of someone who had been making necessary decisions for a very long time. I think we should all go inside, he said, and that Lord Aldry and I should speak privately about this engagement. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Myron sat in the library with Calder, and the fire burned steadily between them, and the silence was, for the first time in 3 days, entirely comfortable. When her father appeared in the doorway, his face was tired and decided. The engagement is dissolved, he said. Fenton had left by the side entrance. Her father looked at Calder for a long moment. I believe you have a considerable amount to explain to me, Lord Voss. Yes, sir, Calder said. I do. I would like to begin with an apology and end with a request. He came in and sat down, and Calder told him everything, and when it was finished, her father sat quietly for a while. The apology is accepted, he said finally, and the request. We will discuss it properly, with appropriate time and the appropriate people present. He looked at Myron, with a look that contained a great many things it would take weeks to fully say. But I am not saying no. It was not a yes. It was something better than a yes. It was a door left open by a man who had always been, at his core, someone who chose his daughter's happiness over the easier road. She held Calder's gaze across the firelit room and found him already looking back. 2 years later, Mirren stood in the long corridor of Voss House and watched snow fall through the tall windows and thought about broken wheels. It was a gentle snow, the unhurried kind, settling on the stone balustrade and the bare garden beds and the lane beyond the gate, with the equanimity of something that had nowhere else to be. Nothing like the storm that had raged over Hartwell Cross 2 years ago. Nothing like that storm at all. That storm had been relentless and certain of itself. This one seemed content simply to be present. Warmth at her back, hands at her waist. The smell of cold air and clean linen that she had come to understand meant winter in this house. Meant her husband, standing behind her. Meant home. You are doing it again, Calder said against her hair, watching the snow with that specific expression. She turned in his arms and looked at him. He had learned over 2 years to read her expressions with the same precision he brought to everything he had decided to understand thoroughly, and she had stopped being surprised by this, though it still caught her off guard with some regularity. What expression is that? The one that means you are doing the arithmetic on chance, he said, counting up how many things had to go exactly wrong in order for everything to go right. I was thinking about the road, she admitted, about how close it was. The coachman could have taken the east road. The wheel could have held another mile. But it didn't. No. She looked at the snow. None of it did. From the main hall below them came the sound of people, her brother's carrying laugh, her mother's comfortable protest, the lower, steady conversation of Calder's sister, who had arrived that morning with her husband, and a determination to make this Christmas proper in every detail. The house was warm and full in a way it had not been for a long time. "The solicitor's letter came," he said. She waited. Fenton's acknowledgement of the court's finding. "The restitution terms are agreed, and in writing." He said it with the quietness of something long finished. Not triumph, not even satisfaction precisely. Something more like the feeling of setting down a weight that had been carried so long, its absence was almost disorienting. "My father's name is restored in the full public record." She looked at him for a moment. "How does it feel?" He considered this honestly, the way he considered everything that deserved honesty. "Like something has been put down that I had been holding for years," he said. "And like I am still learning what to do with my hands now that I am not holding it." She took his hands in hers and held them. "I have some suggestions." He looked at their joined hands, and the expression that moved across his face was one she had seen perhaps a dozen times in 2 years, and which still, each time, affected her with the same force. The expression of someone who was still mildly astonished, at a fundamental level, that this was his life, that it had become available to him. "Do you remember," she said, "what you told me on that road? When I asked why you were offering to help me when you clearly did not want to?" He thought back, that it would be unconscionable not to. "Even for me." "Even for me," she said, and smiled. "As though your own standards were something you were still in negotiation with." "I may have been presenting a less favorable version of myself than was entirely accurate." "You were exactly yourself," she said. "That was the first moment I thought, under everything else, that there was something worth knowing there." She turned back to the window, staying where she was, his arms around her, the snow falling gently beyond the glass. Below them, the voices of their family moved through the warm rooms of a house that had been too quiet for too long. She had not chosen the broken wheel. She had not chosen the snowstorm, or the single room, or the 3 days of nowhere else to be. But every moment after the first one had been a choice, made quietly and repeatedly, and with increasing certainty. His and hers both. He had chosen her before he had the courage to say so. She had known what she wanted before she was ready to ask for it. And 2 years on, standing in the snow light of a house that was hers, held by a man who had once been her betrothed, sworn enemy, and was now the person she trusted most in the world, she found she had no remaining argument with how any of it had happened. Some storms were not something you survived. They were something you were made by. And some enemies, when you finally stopped to look at them clearly in the honest light of a country inn, with nowhere left to hide, turned out to have been waiting, just as you had been waiting, for someone brave enough to stop pretending they had no choice. They had always had a choice. They had chosen each other. That, in the end, was the whole of the story.